And then you have the whole questions of, even if you take, the phenomenal amount of man hours that's gone into ISO 1522 and ISO 2022, how many SMPG working groups are there around the world that have come up with their own versions of that?
The market practice groups.
Market practice groups.
Yes.
Multiply that, for example, in Europe, when you had the Shareholder Rights Directive, when every single country was allowed to create its own variants, its own legal interpretations or regulatory interpretations of that in their local country law. The discipline it takes to have a standard is just immense, and there's too much centrifugal force, I think, to be able to create something that is just a widget. And so I think, for me, that those are all the reasons why not. I think on the positive side, where people have, created standardized messages, there is an incredible upside. And I think everything we're saying so far, it makes it sound like basically there's no progress being made at all. But actually, if you look around the world, some of the markets that have created good standards have really delivered some substantial efficiencies, 80, 90% upticks in kind of levels of automation, radical reductions in callback volumes, in error rates, that kind of thing. So I think there is potential for progress, but I don't think that any one solution is necessarily going to be, you can't just deploy one technology or one standard. It ends up being a patchwork quilt that spans all the issues, all the problems that an investor has, all the way through to all the problems that an investor will have.
Indeed. Now, obviously we're as the CSD, the first party to standardize this information. I think most of the CSDs of the world have embraced ISO messaging standards with their participants, but the further you go down the chain to the investor, the lack of consistent messaging standards we'll find. If you're an asset manager with a holding, large holding across a lot of different funds that might have a lot of different custodial agents holding those securities, for a single event, you may receive 20 different announcements that look slightly different as interpreted. You mentioned there's slight interpretations as this information flows down. So at the end of the day, the asset manager has no recourse but to reconcile all of the information they're receiving from their various agents. And the perversity of this whole process is that record started its life as a single document, a single digitized record of the CSD, and was broken into a million pieces, only to have the asset manager try to, put Humpty Dumpty back together again. Yeah, maybe the task before us: how do we move Humpty Dumpty through these various systems and chains and some of the fragmentation, Dan, that you were describing, to the investor somewhat intact, right? And how do we rethink that process? But Dan, I don't know if you had any comments on that kind of fragmentation and maybe how modern technologies like digital assets, or more specifically smart contracts, might play a role in reducing this interpretation. Can you comment?
Well, this was the dream of Tim Berners-Lee, the founder of, I think many claim, the founder of Internet as we know it. His vision was the semantic web. And it wasn't the way the Internet actually evolved. As we understand it, it really was that all objects across all systems had a way of describing themselves in a consistent way. That was what the vision was. As it turns out, it devolved to that we would all have a mechanism by which messages can be routed. And we never actually got to the original vision, which was the semantic web. And what we're talking about here is a challenge of semantics. Understanding meaning across all of these systems in a consistent way. Well, guess what? There's a new opportunity. It's actually a radical new opportunity based on some of the new technologies to actually achieve that original vision. So blockchain is a piece, but not the only piece of this puzzle. So let's talk about why there's hope with blockchain. What's new that it introduces? Most people know it as being a mechanism universally that allows me to move value and understand the movement of value. It does that by having a very specific action, the signing of a transaction by a wallet that can only be done by that party in order to execute movement of value. That's interesting, but not the most game-changing piece. The fact that I can understand now who caused a piece of data to change. This is the concept of provenance. Who applied this meaning? In what context was that meaning applied? That is the radical transformation here. Blockchain is a trustless system. A zero trust system is another way of saying it. That is, there is no system administrator on blockchain networks. That's both intimidating and exciting in the end. I can build a data system. I can build a database where I can know exactly who described what row and column in that database and under what form of meaning did they make that description. I can introduce over that standard ways of describing the meaning, and I can know who set that definition and then who set the value associated with it. So I have provenance. I have all the way back to the core, who said and why. But the fact that the problem with standards isn't the standards themselves, it's the implementation of the standards that's the problem. Take, for example, maybe I have a column in ISO 222 that is asset type. And one party who works in equities considers, oh, that fixed income stuff, that's just fixed income to me. But if you're a fixed income specialist, it matters. Is it annuity? Is principal at maturity? What type of this is it? Now, if you're representing those things in your system and you don't care about all that, you call it fixed income. But that's going to cause a breakage in this other party's system where they actually need to know the specific distinctions. But if you don't have a mechanism to enforce those rules when the data goes in, bad data in means bad data out. Yeah. But now with what we're introducing to blockchain networks in a data framework is the ability to actually describe things in a consistent way such that standards can be enforced upfront and implemented in a consistent way. Now we have a whole different substrate to work from for corporate actions. Now we can actually know that the issuer attested this, or that the CSD posited that this is true and the issuer confirmed it as it then goes out to the shareholders. We can see that confirmation along the way, and we can understand the provenance of data, but we can understand that it has common meaning, and then automate the actions, corporate actions based on that. That's a radically different world. It fundamentally, I believe, has the potential to address the costs that you were referring to, Barney.
Absolutely, and I think the only thing I'd add, if I may, is also just on top of that, if you then have auditable programming rules, basically smart contracts, to say, okay, well, if custodian 1 basically receives a certain type of event and processes it this way using a smart contract, and then it will go downstream in a following way, the ability for an investor to turn around to custodian 1 and say, right, I want to see your programming rules for that smart contract versus this custodian versus that custodian. The due diligence on those smart contracts becomes actually part of the whole investor-custodian relationship, which then drives standardization, because a major institutional investor can turn around and say, look, you're doing this differently from the other three. It's causing a break every time your smart contract triggers this as being blue, not red, or whatever it is. Therefore, we need you to change it. So I think, as you said, it puts us on a very different path.
So that first, it makes the regulator's life easier, because you have that verifiability. You don't have to look at 1,000 different systems and the way that they implement each on their own.
Yep.
The way we like to say this is, instead of the asset being in 1,000 systems, now the system is in the asset. What that means is the smart contract can be programmed with the logic of the asset itself.
Yep.
And now you confirm it once, and it's executed consistently across all of the different participants, the holders, the wallets that are out there. But that makes it much more observable, much more consistent, and the opportunity to finally automate this challenging problem once and for all is at hand. But make no mistake, this is an enormous set of tasks. The variability, the number of edge cases in corporate actions, there's so many. Did this foreign investor elect for their tax withholding to be done in this particular way, and so on? Those all have to be programmed into these smart contracts. And frankly, a lot of smart contracting language is too limited to be able to handle all of those cases. So that's another part of the challenge as we move forward.
Yeah, and I think, for me, the challenge we face right now is that it's a bit like a donut. The middle of it, dividends, simple stuff. Nobody has a business case for changing that stuff at the moment, because it works to 99 0.x% efficiency. So realistically, the high volume things, it's all of the fringe cases that are the problem. And so therefore, it's very hard to get scale out of anything, because ultimately there is no one thing that gets you 90% of the way and then you do the last 10%. The 90% is not even part of this. It's the 10. We're only focused here on the 10%, and that's where. And it's every one step at a time. Every one of those rules. How do we crack that? Move on to the next. How do we crack that? So it's a long journey.
Yeah.